I'm Jenny Lloyd. I'm a head of practice at Collaborate, and I'm joined here today with by two of my colleagues, Dawn Plimmer, who will be hosting the conversation we'll have shortly, and also my colleague Ellen, who will be playing the part of Collaborate Tech Support. You can see from people's names within the kind of video windows the kind of the name label Collaborates Tech, and if you have any kind of questions or technical problems or anything like that, then just pop it in the chat, and you can choose to specifically send it to Collaborate Tech. Here's Ellen. I think she's already saying hello to herself, so that's good. So there's a little bit of housekeeping to do. One of the things that we wanted to also make clear is that we're trying to make these sessions as accessible as possible. And as part of that, I should have given an audio description of myself. So I'm Jenny Lloyd. I'm a middle-aged white woman with ginger hair. As we go through, then we'll be asking everyone who speaks to introduce themselves in that sort of way for those people who need greater access. We're also recording the session, and those kind of audio descriptions also make it a more accessible recording for those people who access it afterwards. So that's why we're doing that. This is part of a series of events. Obviously, it's only Tuesday, so HLS week is only 2 days through. There's plenty more events that are going on for the next few days. So I'd invite you to make sure that you've had a look at the full agenda and chosen any further events that you might like to go to as well. We're also promoting this using social media, as you'd expect. And so if anyone is on Twitter and wants to take part in the conversation there, we're using the hashtag HLS week. So fairly standard and quite obvious. So what we're going to do today is have a conversation about how HLS has been practiced by a team in Liverpool. And so that's the kind of in-depth kind of bit of this session. But we also wanted to get a sense of the kind of breadth of HLS practice as in use in local authorities. And so we're going to try out a different tool. So let's call it experimental. It's a learning feature. And so what we're inviting you to do is to click on the link that Ellen has put into the chat and open up a map. And in that map, we're going to ask you to put some details of your HLS practice into that map, in the hope that we can have a sense of plotting them geographically and have an asset that we can go back to in the future. So we are testing this for the first time in a webinar today. So very much hoping that you'll all be able to use the map feature. And if you have any tech problems, then we can help you out. So there's, I can hand over to Alan in a minute just to describe how to use that. But I also wanted to invite you to participate fully in this. Although we have invited 5 people to describe the work that they're doing, we're also interested in the work that the audience, as it is engaged in as well. So we've got different ways in which you can take part in this session. So there's the chat, obviously, and I can see that people are making good use of the chat function so far. Again, you should have a row of buttons at the bottom of your screen, and so there's a chat function there. It's pretty standard. There's also a Q&A button there too. And so if you've got any specific questions that you want to be asked of the 5 people who are participating in the conversation, you can use the Q&A function. And that's a really good way of making it more obvious to us that you want to ask a question. But you can also keep an eye on that and see if there's any questions that other people have placed that actually you're interested in too. So you can sort of upvote those questions that you find most interesting. And what we'll try is to pick out those questions, and as far as we can within the time that we've got, we'll pass them on to Dawn, and she'll be able to pose them to the participants. So that's 2 things. And then we've got another thing, which is Slido. So we have some questions that we want to pose to you as a group as well. And we'll be posing those questions throughout the session, and asking you to use Slido to answer them. So there's a link, another link that Ellen will also post in the chat here, which you can open up in the background. At the moment, it's really boring, there's nothing in there. But as we pose questions, then they'll become apparent to you. And as people start to populate the answers to those questions, you'll start to see word clouds appearing, and then we'll get some kind of sense of the kind of collective view on the questions that we're asking. So those are the tools that we're using. Obviously, different people want different experiences from these kind of sessions. So if you want to sit back and just listen, that's fine. But if actually you want to be kind of a bit more engaged in it and share more about what you do and what you think, and give us more of a sense of kind of experiences across different local authorities, then please do take part in all these different ways that I've just described. So I'm going to hand over to Ellen now. She's just going to give you a quick overview about how to use this kind of map function. Over to you, Ellen.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all today. It sounds as if our magical map solution may create more problems than it's worth at this stage, because it's asking people to leave Zoom in order to enter the map. So if that's the case, what we'll do is we'll share the link to the map later on, and I can instead share that with you after the session, and we'll build up that content there. But we'd love to start to capture all the different places and practices where HLS is happening. So perhaps instead of joining it onto the map, if you'd like to write in chat a short description of where you are and what your practice is looking like at the moment, we can add that in later. But for now, let's skip the map itself and come back to your main content. Thanks, Jenny.
Beautifully adaptive, thank you, Ellen. In which case I'll skip through the second part. It would be interesting if you do add information into the chat, if you also say where you are. So use a postcode if possible, but I won't bang on about that, we'll move on. We also recognise that some people in the room might well not be that familiar with HLS as a kind of concept. You must in some way be interested in it, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. But we also recognise that there's plenty of practice which is related to HLS, which people don't necessarily call HLS. So we're just giving a quick overview here about kind of what we term HLS. So Human.Learning.Systems is based on action research that's been conducted by Collaborate alongside a variety of different partners, and primarily with Toby Lowe, who's well, an academic but on secondment to CPI. And so there's a kind of collective view on this. This isn't something that's proprietary. Instead, the kind of research has turned up loads of different examples of particular kind of practice. So they're sort of practical examples of things that people are doing differently, but they share similar features, and they're rooted in a kind of realization that the world that we live in is complex, that the lives of all the people who live in that world are complex, that we are interconnected beings, that there's dynamics in those relationships, so that changing one thing creates unexpected changes in others. And so there's a kind of unpredictability in that world. And so that the way that we manage public services, which has previously been sort of dominated by the idea of management metrics and markets, that has produced results that don't work particularly well particularly for certain kinds of people. And so the question has been how does public service, the public sector, embrace and work with complexity in different ways? And so Human.Learning.Systems is the kind of starting point to identify ways in which you can answer that question. And so the three key points are about being human, so treating people as individuals with strengths, joining up the support that people have between services, so trying not to work in such a siloed way, making practice relational, and devolving decision maker closer to communities and the people who are affected by the decisions being made. So second in the list is learning. So recognizing that in complexity, we don't know the answers for many things, that one thing that works in one particular place might not work in the same way for different people in a different place. And so that learning is then central to understanding how to improve things. So ongoing and continuous learning, rather than having sort of set outcomes which are then sort of measured against. And then final point is recognizing that we are all part of, and everything that we work in is part of interconnected, interdependent systems. And that therefore nurturing healthy systems based on trusting relationships, shared purpose and deep listening is the kind of fundamental for understanding how to serve the public better. So with that very quick whiz through, I'll hand over to Dawn Plimmer, and Dawn is going to take us through the conversation with our kind of participants. I just should say that we invite you to continue to participate through the different tools that we'll provide. So handing over to you, Dawn. I'll scoot through the slides so we're in the right place.
Thanks, Jenny. We can't actually see the slides, but I'm happy to share them for the next bit.
I had no idea you weren't able to see them. I'm so sorry. I can see them brilliantly on my side, on my screen.
But yeah, I'm happy to share those. Thanks, Jenny. So I realise we've thrown a load of stuff at you there, but for the bulk of the discussion, we're now going to dive into exploring what human learning system looks like in a specific practical example in Liverpool. So as a quick introduction, I'm Dawn from Collaborate. I'm a white woman in her 30s, curly brown hair, and I'm wearing a purple jumper today. I realise I'm very on brand for Collaborate with Collaborate Purple. So I'm going to guide us through a discussion in a moment. Firstly, you'll get to hear from all of our speakers, and then we'll work through a discussion where you'll have a chance as the audience to participate throughout. And in particular, we'll get to hear from our speakers about kind of what HLS looks like, what it feels like, what's next, how the work is evolving over time. My one caveat is this isn't a how-to guide to do HLS. I'm sure you'll get loads of inspiration from today, but HLS looks different in different contexts. So our colleagues from Liverpool are part of a local authority, Human.Learning.Systems learning community that we host. And the practice looks very different in different places. We've got some local authorities who are really taking an approach that isn't so focused on commissioning. It is more focused on how do we get out into our communities, do ethnographic research to really understand what matters to people in their place. And they're trying to develop more collaborative services from there. So we've got other participants who are, testing out a HLS approach and how they're developing community hubs. So I just wanted to caveat, we thought today it'd be great to go deep into a specific example, but there are many different ways that local authorities are adopting HLS, which is what the map, or the chat version of the map, is all about. So before I hand over to our speakers, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a flavour of what approach they're taking in Liverpool. So Liverpool City Region Combined Authority adopted a HLS approach right from the start when they were commissioning their assertive outreach homelessness service back in 2019. I was just saying to Katie, I remember Toby Lowe and I went to visit early on in 2019, spoke to the team about HLS, and I'm always amazed about how far in time. And I think for me, what's particularly exciting about the example is they did explicitly take a HLS approach from the start, rather than coming to that later on. So as I said, Liverpool Combined Authority, Katie and the team adopted this in 2019. And what it meant for them to take a HLS approach was firstly, really trying to shake up the typical dynamic between providers and commissioners. So trying to develop a much more honest, trusting relationship rather than one based on competition. And in turn, try to create better relationships between providers themselves rather than pitting them against each other in competition. Secondly, being led by learning, picking up one of your comments in the chat, Catherine, being led by learning rather than being focused on KPIs, on predefined approaches or targets. Linked to this, really trying to reset that commissioner-provider relationship. So it's not, based on let's submit loads of monitoring reports that sit on a shelf. Instead, it was how do we create those reflective spaces where we can learn and adapt our work together. Success is continually adapting based on the changing context and what we're learning, not sticking to a predefined contract for 3 years. And then finally, adopting a system stewardship approach. So Jenny just gave you a flavour of what we mean by system stewardship. So someone or an organisation that takes responsibility for and nurture a healthy system. And I'm really pleased that we've got Alex here today, who's been playing that system stewardship role, sitting in the combined authority. So she's had a particular focus on building relationships and enabling learning. And some really interesting experiences and insights about what that looks and feels like and the benefits that we'll hear more about today. So really briefly, I won't talk through all the detail, but just to give you a flavour of how this work has evolved over time. So starting back in 2019, the combined authority worked with 5 local authorities in the region to commission a first contract based on a human learning systems approach. A few key features of this approach was firstly, really fundamentally shifting communication. So it was that live, honest conversation between providers and local authorities, live ongoing problem solving together, rather than just meeting every 6 months in a contract meeting. So it's much more a sense of shared endeavour, learning together, bringing our intelligence together to do what's best for the people we're supporting. Through frontline engagement, so really involving practitioners in that learning, that reflection, that continuous improvement based on their experiences and insights. The flexibility offered by working in this way was really important. So rather than sticking to a really narrow service spec, the ability to support people as they're moving doors, for example, not just when they were sleeping, which was particularly important during COVID, but also more generally in enabling a preventative approach. And so really interesting ways of getting around typical governance barriers. So some interesting ways of kind of trying to find temporary ways to create clinical integration. And then finally, that constant focus on refining, checking, reflecting on relationships within the system. So it's not just about delivering a service, it is about creating those conditions, those relationships, that trust, that learning, that supports even better delivery over time. So as you'll hear today, everyone learned lots from across the system during that first contract, and they've just entered into a second contract based on everything they've learned. One of those learnings was that actually only 3 of the 5 local authorities are now part of the current commission contract, because the other 2 local authorities areas admitted through honest conversations that actually they didn't need that provision right now. There's been a continued focus on flexibility for clinical roles, building on the learning from the previous contract, and some specific funding allocated to areas where we've learned that more support is needed. So, for example, this trusted assessor role to break down barriers for people trying to navigate between different bits of the system, different bits of support. So as you'll hear today, taking a human learning systems approach has really contributed to enabling more honest, frank conversations. But yeah, as you'll hear today, also lots of areas where this work is going to continue to evolve over time. So I can't do justice to all the brilliant work in 2 minutes, but that's just a bit of a flavour that we'll build on as we hear from our speakers. So if I could ask all of you just to give a brief intro. So Katie, I'll come to you first.
Hi, I'm Katie, middle-aged, brown, medium hair, wearing a red and stripy jumper, and I am the commission and contracts lead around homelessness for the Liverpool City region. Thank you. Thanks, Katie. Alex, can I come to you next?
Yeah, I'm Alex Palmer, so I work with Katie in our homelessness services for the Liverpool City region as working in contract and review, but also the systems steward for assertive outreach. I'm a 30-year-old white woman with brown hair that's pulled back in a ponytail wearing a blue shirt.
Thanks, Alex. And Tony, can I come to you?
Hi, I'm a white woman in my 40s with curly brown hair, glasses and a black hoodie. I am the manager for the outreach services in the city region, delivered by the Whitechapel, and I work very closely with Alex Palmer and Katie with my commissioners.
Thanks, Tony. Sophie.
Hi, yeah, I'm Sophie, and I am a white woman in her 30s with long brown hair and glasses. I am a service manager at the Whitechapel Centre, so I work with Tony, so I line manage Tony. I also work not only in the city region, but also in Liverpool itself. I have another outreach team in Liverpool, so I have a view of both areas.
Thanks, Sophie. And last but not least, Kevin.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kevin Kearns. I'm a white male in my late 40s, sadly, with dark hair, which isn't dyed, I'd like to add, and I'm wearing a purple jumper, but my day job is the Homeless and Housing Policy Officer at St Helens Council.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, everyone. And as you'll see, what's particularly exciting about this conversation is we don't just have Katie and Alex at the Combined Authority, but we do have Kevin from St Helens, and also providers, Sophie and Tony. So it really is an opportunity to kind of hear what this looks and feels like in different parts of the system, not only for a local authority. As I'm going to kick off by asking a question of our speakers. So the question is, what's different between how you work together now and how you used to work? Well, what does it actually look like in your day-to-day work? So while you're pondering that, I'm just also going to introduce a parallel question that we're going to pose to you as an audience. So Ellen's going to pop a link to a Slido page in the chat in a moment. And what we'd like to ask of you as an audience, while you're listening to our speakers, how does the experience in Liverpool compare to your own? What's similar or different to the practice you feel in your day-to-day work? So there's a Q&A function if you want to ask questions of our speakers, but also in the Slido, it would be great if you can reflect on that question as we go. So Katie, I'll come to you first. And what's different for you with this HLS approach?
Sorry, just to mute myself. I think what is different for myself as a commissioner is I feel that the actual learning that we take and we receive is actually really impacting on what we're delivering. And the difference is we have commissioned a service that is able to be flexible and responsive to the needs of each local authority. When you're asked to, or you're given funding to deliver a city region service, you need to acknowledge differences in each area, but also you need to enable a provider to respond different and to be confident, and for them to take the lead, rather than it being a top-heavy relationship. And I think maybe what is different, it takes a lot of work. You know, we meet regularly, we're involved a lot together, we communicate a lot, but we can also respond quickly to issues. In some ways, from a commissioning point, you have to take some little risks to get bigger rewards. And I think because this service, and that's down to people like Kevin in the local authority, and specifically the Whitechapel, have worked so well, we've been able to prove ourselves in the sense that the proof is in the pudding. So we've been given a little bit more freedom. So I think that feels different. And I think one of the real things I'm very passionate about is that we're able to get reality in the sense of outcomes, instead of in the past I would be asked to look at specifications that looked at how many clients or rough sleepers were linked in with drug and alcohol services. Now, when you're commissioning a service and you're asking for those outcomes, you're setting them up to fail straight away, because most of our rough sleepers would never get in services, or they don't engage. So what we're doing is we're actually setting up service learning and outcomes that actually really impact on what we're doing, instead of what we think we should be doing. And we're then not able to give the answers from a professional that they want to hear, then they panic. So what we're actually doing is we're getting a real honest reflection of the need, which in turn impacts on what else we commission and what other work we do. So I think it's a more realistic, truthful picture, which at times is not easy to take, because, you know, the Whitechapel keep us on our toes. You have to respond, you have to do things. And we're very lucky to have Alex, because she does a lot of that front response, but it has helped along the system with other areas of work.
Thanks, Katie. That's a really great introduction and insight. And you've picked up on a question in the chat around a keenness to learn about approaches to outcome assessment that don't involve irrelevant KPIs. So I know, you do have to report to government departments, but could you say a little bit about how you both use data, but use it in a way that is much more focused on learning?
Okay, so we obviously, data is still really important, but we actually, when we're doing our reports, we do about our impact from learning. And we're also always asking ourselves, what do we do differently in the next quarter? So for example, when we reduce the service, you think, oh gosh, you've got to cut it. But that was a great thing to do because there were other RSI funded projects that weren't, and this service wasn't required. So we were able to invest money in other areas. Again, we also regularly meet with our funders. They go out and they meet the Whitechapel. They also meet the local authorities. So I think that helps because they can see what's going on. But we still do provide data, but our reports are much more led on learning. So when Alex talks, she will talk about a learning framework she does with staff. That sort of information is all shared.
Thanks, Katie. That's really helpful. And Alex, did you want to come in on that as well?
Yeah, I was just going to add that one of the things that I think has been really helpful and important is that we try and develop what we report on with the Whitechapel. Obviously, they're seeing and experiencing the need for our rough sleepers in their delivery. So we do try and I think I've had regular conversations recently with Sophie and Tony, reviewing how we're reporting the data that we're trying to capture, just to really ask them what's actually useful, what gives us the bigger picture, what do you think we should be saying that we're not currently saying. It can be really hard, like developing data around and within this type of framework model, because I think often we get so much information because we can be so close to how the service, what the service is delivering, and it's sometimes just trying to filter out the impact and the learning. So it can be, we're still very much in development around that, but we're hoping that what we can and will share moving forward across this new contract will just really highlight the benefit of like a human learning systems approach to that. So yeah, trying to do it in partnership with, so that, like Katie said before, we're not just asking for Whitechapel to give us the numbers we want to see, but we're actually really listening and we really want to understand the challenge on the ground. So yeah, that was all I was going to add.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Alex. So not only are you learning together, but you're even setting the framework and deciding what to learn about together as well, right from the start. Kevin, can I come to you next? What's the experience been like working at St Helens?
Yeah, hi. I think it's been really a valuable experience in the sense that it has been a very different way of commissioning services for ourselves from a local authority perspective, where I think one of the phrases Katie often uses is co-production. So it was very much a sort of jointly commissioned service. So the Liverpool City Region Combined Authority were asking individual local authorities what our needs were, because our need was different than maybe what other authorities was in the city region. So that sort of service was designed around that. And I think for me, it's about a very valid point is it's not just about KPIs anymore. It is about that human learning and what is the service delivering for our clients and our customers. But having that sort of faith to commission a service, you've got trust in to deliver in that way. So it's not just a service that is about numbers going out saying, well, we found 40 rough sleepers last month. Well, what we're now doing is saying to the Whitechapel staff, well, why were those 40 people sleeping out in St Helens? Because we're trying to get ahead of the game to stop them spending one night on the street. So it's been really valuable. And obviously we're now working on other projects with the combined authority to commission other services in St Helens as well.
Brilliant, thanks, Kevin. That's really helpful, particularly how the rapid pace which you're constantly seeking to act on that learning to improve things all the time really strikes me as different to how traditional services are often commissioned, and that lag often between, if firstly if the insight is shared and there's an appetite to share honestly, that often the lag it takes to act on it, which feels a lot more rapid in this case. And Tony, Sophie, I'd love to come to you. What's it felt like from a provider perspective, and what's different to what you might have encountered before?
What's different from my point of view from the Whitechapel Centre is the the regular communication. So in traditional commissioning relationships, you have contract management meetings and you'll have emails back and forward, but they're very top heavy. So it's sort of, we need this information from you, we need you to do this. Whereas ours and mine and Alex's relationship is a conversation. So she'll ask me about information, and then she'll say, why do you think that is? Why do you think all of a sudden we've had 5 women rough sleeping where they weren't before? What do you think we need to do about that? And we have weekly meetings where we talk about all the issues that are presented. But the other thing that happens is that Alex comes on outreach with us, regularly, meets the staff, and then goes and meets the clients. And often we've had a challenging case that I've been describing to Alex, and when she's met them, she's gone, I totally understand now, because she's met that human being, and she can see why we might be struggling to go down the traditional routes with that. When we first started, it took a little while for me to realise that we can be honest back and forward, and it doesn't mean we were going to lose our contract straight away. But it took that, those conversations back and forth for us to understand that trust was both ways. Like I said, Katie said before, we ask a lot. We'll ring up and we'll ask for meetings, and we'll ask for solutions for people that we probably wouldn't be as bold in other areas, because we just wouldn't sort of be as forthcoming. But also we do things that are really creative, and I can't think of an example, but we do things that don't fit the mould to try them, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. COVID meant that all my staff at different times were doing different things, because we just could change on the day, on the week, on the hour, what we needed to do to make sure that everybody was supported during the pandemic. And that's probably, I'd say, one of the biggest successes is we got through that, and we did that quite well.
Thanks, Tony. I mean, it's so much of what you're saying, like just trust, it's that shared understanding, that willingness to be honest, and the bolder and bigger ideas that leads to really jumps out. Sophie, I realise you've joined the work more recently, joined Whitechapel more recently. What's it been like for you?
I think, it's although I'm new to Human Learning Systems as an approach, but I think it was quite obvious to me when I came to work at Whitechapel to see the strength of the relationship between Tony and her team and the commissioning side of things. So I think, like Tony said, very key is that Alex does come out on outreach, and I think that the issues that a frontline service face and the challenges that we face can sometimes feel quite lonely as frontline workers, and so to have commissioners on board and to feel like they're frontline with us sometimes it helps for them and for the staff as well, the frontline staff, to feel appreciated and feel like they can feedback honestly about what they're experiencing, because the commissioners know what it's like as well. So that's been really helpful. Oh, Tony, you're going to say something?
No, I was just going to give a really good example of what Alex understood when she came out with this. So we cover a ginormous geographical area. It's really, really big, and it's also difficult to get between the two. And I think once Alex spent about 3 days with us flying around, she's got a totally different understanding of how much time it might take us to get from one area to the other, and how different those areas look. So that's an example that if you were a commissioner who would never actually come out on the ground and seen those, just seeing the distance that we travel, that never would have been understood. So that's and the team really, really appreciated that.
And I think that it allows us to, like Tony was saying, sort of, it allows everyone to be able to make mistakes, because that's how you can learn. And I think there is a big fear of making mistakes in commission services. To be able to win future contracts and have our stats looking really shiny, but that's not actually helping the end user of the service. So that's another difference, which I think is really valuable.
Yeah, thanks, Sophie. We've had a few questions in the chat about capacity. So obviously it requires a certain amount of capacity from a commissioner, but in terms of a frontline worker being asked to engage in these learning spaces, these learning conversations, how do you manage that as part of your workload?
It was that Alex joined the work that they did, so she didn't ask them to take their time out. She came on outreach, and we went and had a coffee, and she asked them what they thought, and we had an honest conversation for an hour. So we didn't pull them into the office environment and say, you must come and meet your commissioner like it was a big deal. She joined them where they were. She did case studies with them, so it was very much like she was shadowing them for the day.
Really kind of coming to join you rather than being a distant commissioner requesting information. Yeah, that shared problem solving really jumps out. And we've had a few questions also about how did you tackle the governance and red tape? How did you actually get this service commissioned? Katie, can I come to you for that one?
Thanks. We did it quietly, gently, and we did it on a small scale, that one service, because I always believe wait till the proof is in the pudding. We obviously followed all correct procurement procedures regarding outcomes and stuff. There was quite heated conversations with funders about what we wanted to do, but there was also a recognition, and I must say I'm part of the commissioning for Housing First, and that was all about a different approach and change. So I think element was good timing, but I would strongly suggest, and I've done quite a few of these sessions with people, is start small. Don't go for these big grand plans. At the part of learning processes, you don't have everything written down in an orderly process. Otherwise, you can't adapt and change. If you think by this quarter we're going to hit that, you've got to be prepared to adapt and change every day. But I think you still follow. There was still a procurement process specification that requested a provider that would be flexible and responsive to learning and need and to demand. And I think Sophie very clearly, what she said was, I presented lots of arguments of, I have spent years commissioning and delivering services in the old way. We still have got increased homelessness. So why can't we try something different? And let's see. So I think it's just taking that, small approach quietly and let the service speak for itself.
And thanks, Katie. We've got a few follow-up questions about how and did you involve senior leaders, members, or was it so small you could kind of do it without being delegated?
We involved all the 6 local authorities, so that helped. They were all involved, the 5 local authorities, but Liverpool was still aware of it. So that helped. And yes, I wrote a paper on part of my approvals for the funding, etc., and said we were taking a different approach, and talked about a much more different approach within contract monitoring and a learning approach. And I think so that helped. Yeah, I did. But again, we did it quietly, but I did follow all those sorts of processes. And I think it's I think once you do it on a smaller scale, we were commissioning £4 or £5 million projects, so this was quite smaller scale, which helps. So, and I got very much on board our funders. I spent a lot of time getting them on board.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And I think that chimes with a lot of chat we heard at events yesterday about starting small, big enough to show that something can be different, but small enough that it can fail if it doesn't work. Yeah. Very often it doesn't. I mean, very often it does work and doesn't fail. Kevin, I just wondered before we move on, whether you wanted to come in on that question about how you engage colleagues within the Borough Council in this different way of working.
Yeah, so obviously when we were pulling together the specification, we sort of had to go to our senior sort of executive leadership team and explain that we were sort of being part of this joint commission service. And I think really one thing we've done is we have learned throughout the process, haven't we, that so the clinical element of the service at first, we went off and we found a few hiccups, but we were able to overcome and adapt those probably in each different authority. So certainly, yeah, we had to run it through our sort of political system that we were sort of supporting this, and this service would be operating in our borough, but we were very much sort of welcoming and open to the service coming in and working as part of the combined authority as well.
Thanks, Kevin. So I'm going to move on to our second question now and continue to try and pick up a few things in the chat. So we've talked about what's different, but now I'd really like to explore a little bit more about what it feels like to work in this way, because I know it can be incredibly scary when you're trying to rip up the rule book a bit, work in a very different way, get away from control and compliance and try to take that more emergent approach, particularly when the rest of the system around you is working in a very different way. So yeah, I'd be really interested in how it's felt to work in this way, and particularly any particular highs or particular lows you've experienced along the way. And Alex, how about you? Coming in new as a system steward, what was it like for you?
So I obviously really enjoy working in this way. I think it pulls on my strengths, which is great. I think the hardest, I do find it really hard, and Katie will back me up on this. I do find working in a human learning systems way difficult. I think not for potentially like negative reasons as such, but often I think, you know, human learning systems doesn't make us exempt from other issues that happen in frontline work. So we can be as honest and open with each other as we can, but we can still struggle with operational delivery because of things that are outside our control. And I think sometimes we can move into that mindset with taking on a human learning systems approach, that we're almost like immune to the operational challenges that can be faced, or some of the more traditional commissioner provider issues that can come up. But, you know, and also sometimes overcome it when we've obviously tried to commission a service which is both clinical and frontline with the assertive outreach team, and we have had challenges around the clinical side, and working with two very different and distinct systems that overlap takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of work to make progress. And I think Kevin touched on it before. You know, we did have in the last contract we had a clinical nurse and CPN within this contract who were attached to the service, and you know, having those members of staff within this team really highlighted the different governance structures within health, how that works in completely different ways to the local authority governance structures, to how it works in completely different ways to housing governance structures, and even within themselves, mental health and physical health. And sometimes I know that there were some real challenges around just supporting the team to do practical implementation, because we were trying to overcome some of those barriers. So and the pace of change in that was quite slow, but on the positive, by the end of that first contract, we'd made real strides in understanding how we could have a nurse practitioner attached to an outreach team, and you know, we were able to feed that learning into the new contract. So I'd say, yeah, it can, I don't know how to describe, I don't want to describe it in a negative way, because I think the difficulties don't necessarily mean that it is not worth doing. Like, it's definitely worth doing. It's just that sometimes there are things outside our control, and also when we're working across systems, sometimes we don't have the power to make change, and it's about trying to identify who does, and that can take a really long time. So we might see the pace of change happening at a slower scale than we kind of anticipated. I feel like Katie's going to have something to add there.
Thanks, Alex. Katie, I'll come to you in a sec. Just a reminder, if you could keep sharing your reflections on Slido. So the question for you now is, how does it feel to work in a HLS way, either based on your experiences or based on what you're feeling? If you want to pop that on the Slido, Jenny will take a look and we'll feed that into the conversation. So continuing on a Liverpool conversation, Katie, did you want to come back? How has it felt to work in this way? What's been the highs and lows for you?
I mean, I really agree with Alex, and it's the highs and lows are in a traditional service where you have that quarterly paperwork that is based on very prescribed questions, gives a false sense of security at times, because we could just meet and go through that, tick, you know, and what we're doing is we're really scratching underneath, and that requires a level of confidence, a level of, and I think again, Sophie said, and Tony, that it's okay to get things wrong. Obviously, you know, within risks of individuals frontline, but it's okay to get things wrong. And if we don't get things wrong, we don't learn. But what we don't want to do is go back and recommission another service where we knew there was issues with the clinical because we haven't taken any learning. So I think from Alex's point, I totally agree that that can be very difficult when you're a contract monitor or system student. You're having to balance demands, etc. But I think it's that we don't have those traditional functions that maybe give us the security which we think makes us feel better, but actually isn't impacting for people on the streets. And our role, all our roles in public service and public duties, is to ensure that people who receive the service get what they need and are able to get out of our services. So I think that in itself is, it's a constant learning, isn't it? And that could be hard work, learning every week or every day. some days you just go, oh my God, you know. But yeah, so I don't know, is that a fair response, Alex?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And I think that it's like, we don't want to give discredit to the things that have been really positive. Like some of the things, particularly in the last few weeks, I hope Tony and Sophie and Kevin can back me up on this. Like some of the really big positive wins we've had have come recently in this new contract, with seeing the benefit of multi-agency working and people really being flexible around what they're able to offer for our service users. So we've recently had an individual who's been housed, who's been on the streets for, I don't know if it's years, but in and out of the streets for a long time, who's extremely complex. And, you know, that work involved lots of agencies having to come together and really like bend and be flexible and be willing to put the individual first and make sure that he got housed, regardless of kind of the challenges that was posing. And we've got a similar case happening at the moment. And I think, you know, when you sit back and you can see the willingness of all the different services within a local authority coming together and want, you know, I think often we can say, can't we, in public sector services, everyone always comes into this type of work because they do want to make a difference and they're passionate about public services, but often it is the bureaucracy or it is the way, the structures of how things work, which can stop us from sometimes achieving the outcome of service users that we know we would want to be able to deliver. And I think, like, across the lifetime of the service, the team supported by local authorities have been able to help build a culture of collaboration and partnership, which is benefiting our service users. So like there are real highs as well. I think it's just that, like Katie said, learning every day can be really difficult. And also learning is a privilege, isn't it? At the end of the day, our function is to support service users, and the team's job is to make sure that people who are rough sleeping get housed. And sometimes, you know, my role as trying to facilitate opportunities for learning can get pushed to the back because actually we've got someone who's in need and they need to get indoors and the team need to focus resource on that. So, you know, there are highs and lows, I think. Sorry, I could go on for ages. I'll let everyone else talk now.
Thanks, Alex and Katie. That was really useful. And I think what strikes me out is reflecting on the Mayday Trust who were talking yesterday as well. And the end goal is to not institutionalize people, but to let people live a life away from services. And when you get away from KPIs and rigid contracts, it's so much easier to do that when you're putting the person first. There are quite a lot of questions in the chat about involving people with lived experience, the impact on them. We will come back in our third main question to explore that explicitly. So yeah, we will explore that more in a moment. On the question of what it feels like to work in this way, the highs and the lows, Tony, Sophie, I'd kind of love to hear from you from a provider perspective. In particular, we've got a few questions about, you know, what it feels like to collaborate with other organisations like housing colleagues, for example. So yeah, your general feelings of highs and lows, and any thoughts on multi-agency working specifically.
So in terms of the highs and lows, it was a new service in a new way. So I'd never delivered a brand new service from the beginning, which was really exciting. But it was me and a bunch of new staff in new areas where we'd never been before, and saying, hello, we're doing Human.Learning.Systems. And people didn't really know what it was, to be honest. And Alex has done a lot of work on you know, delivering that message. It's really exciting to do a new service, and it was great for me to be able to deliver something brand new and see results really, really quickly. We could not have done that without the local authorities. So St Helens are here and they really absolutely took that on board. They ran with it from day one and said, let's work together. If we would not have had the collaboration of the council and the housing providers in those areas, we wouldn't have housed anybody. You know, I'd have just been wandering around the streets talking to people. But, you know, Kevin and his colleagues was at the front and introducing us to everybody we needed to know. It was a real partnership way of sort of getting to know people. So at the beginning, it was lots of networking, you know, just going out there and, you know, making sure that we had everybody on board. And then the pandemic hit. So it was such a bizarre experience that we had, you know, all those months and then all of a sudden, you know, we were in the middle of a pandemic. But that really gives the opportunity to make our mark. You know, we supported the local authority in St Helens and other areas, and we supported people through that to make sure that people were supported. And we were really privileged to do that. The team got a lot from knowing that they were able to keep people safe and keep people accommodated. The negative sometimes is like Alex said, sometimes you're not quite sure what you should be doing, or sometimes it's easier if there's a tick list, because then, oh, I need to do this on a Monday. So, you know, our conversations are often not linear, they're flexible. That's a good thing, but sometimes, you know, everybody likes things to be the same, don't they? So sometimes that might feel a little bit easier. So it's exciting and scary all at the same time. But I feel now that if we do make a mistake, obviously within bounds of safety, then that's okay. You know, I feel that I could say to Katie, we tried that, it didn't work, let's try X. And then when we have those big wins of accommodating a really, really complex rough sleeper with lots of needs, and that's been, everybody on this call has done that, that's when it feels amazing. You know, that's what makes this kind of project so worthwhile.
Thanks, Tony. Exciting and scary. That seems like a good summary. And yeah, just what comes out is it is a privilege to learn. It's so much more rewarding and motivating to learn, but it is exhausting when you're constantly having to respond to this information all the time. Sophie, what's it been like for you?
Yeah, I think that you've mentioned the Mayday Trust before, who I've done some work with in a previous role in London, and I think similar to with Human.Learning.Systems, when, although yeah, we do have to start small, I think like Katie was saying, that makes sense, because you are having to sort of evidence it to other people in the wider system that it works and it's a good thing to do. And I think that some of the work that I'd done with the Mayday Trust before was doing a sort of a system change for an organisation, which is great, and you can do that within a sort of a small pocket. But then when other parts of the system which you do work with regularly and you know, sort of make contact with and overlap with your work, and if they're kind of they're not part of that, or they're not fully on board with the changes that you're trying to make, that can sometimes be challenging. And I think with any sort of change in a really sort of larger sort of conceptual way, everyone needs to be on board in order for it to be really seamless. And so I think when you're implementing new change like this, it starts off slow, and it can be, I think I saw in the chat someone sort of going against the tide, and it can feel like that sometimes. But it's worth it, because I think we know that this is working for us, and it's a better relationship in the way that we're working with our commissioners. But yeah, when other people aren't necessarily fully on board with what we're doing, hopefully we can show and we can evidence to others in the wider system that it is the way to go.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, and a really strong message coming out from both you and Alex about, you know, if you are working with others who aren't on board, don't get this way of working, who are just, you know, sitting in a different part of the system with very different approaches. The Whitechapel Centre, I assume you have a kind of the contracts of the work that is funded through different approaches. How does it feel to try and kind of do both at once, or are you trying to influence the rest of your work to be more like this?
Yeah, it's interesting for me to have that both those views, and with the Liverpool Outreach Service, which is commissioned by Liverpool City Council, it is different. We do have a very strong relationship with our commissioners, but it is more structured and rigid, and like we've said before, sometimes that does feel like there's a sort of a safety net. You know what you're trying to achieve, and you know what KPIs you need to report on. And yes, I do have quarterly reports, and they do take up a lot of my time, but I think it's really interesting for me to be a part of the assertive outreach in the city region, to hopefully influence the way that I work in other areas as well.
Thanks, Sophie. And Kevin, can I come to you? Kind of, what does it feel like, the highs and lows? So Tony highlighted how much the local authority is invested in this, and also any reflections you've got on like where it's influencing the local authority's work more generally, more widely.
Yeah, certainly. So I think one word I initially wrote down was challenging, but having reflected on that, what I would say is I think we see ourselves as one service now and one team. So I don't see myself as the local authority being part of a commissioning project. I see ourselves with Tony and her team and Alex and Katie as one group of people providing this service for our clients. And I think where you was just your second part of the question, Dawn, about how it influences where we're going. I think what it's shown us is that we do need to think differently, and we've now introduced a sort of complex model in St Helens. So based on Human Learning Systems, we are now bringing together every partner involved in the whole sort of homelessness arena to try to work in this human learning system approach. But I think, as Alex and Sophie said, if we need every provider and every part of that sort of journey to be involved and work in that way, or we can do everything up to a certain point, and then if one organisation perhaps hasn't embraced that and is still working maybe the older system, the system can break down and we can get repeat rough sleeping and homelessness again. But I think generally it's been really rewarding, and I think the proof in the pudding, as Katie said, is our rough sleeping figures have dropped dramatically over the last few years. So quite often we will only find maybe one person on the streets each morning, if that. So, and that's been consistent since the Whitechapel service have been in place.
Well, thanks, Kevin. That is really striking. Firstly, that the rough sleeping has dropped so dramatically, and also the way you describe all of you together as a team. That's so unusual, but so positive that you know, beyond those organisational boundaries, beyond those typical power dynamics, you all just see yourself as a group of people working together for the same cause. And Katie, before we move on, I just really welcome your thoughts on kind of what have been the highs for you, and also was there ever a moment where you're like, this just isn't going to work, we need to abandon the HLS approach?
Yeah, quite often. No, I don't actually. I do know it is going to work, but yeah, I do you get nervous because you're taking maybe managed risks, but you're also aware of the reputational for your provider, for your local authorities. I think when you hear my colleague Kevin say we're one team, I'm just so proud of that. That is such a high, and that Human Learning Systems and our work has influenced the change in complex care's lives in St Helens. We have system stewards in Liverpool City Council now. We have Sefton taking the Human Learning System approach to commissioning. That is a role of the CA to help local authorities. So that is such a high. And when I think our relationship with the providers, Sophie and Tony and her staff, I'm always impressed by that, because that was really a challenge for the Whitechapel. You know, they aren't enabled to be honest. They aren't enabled to say to the commissioner, actually, what you've commissioned or what you're asking isn't realistic. You don't really know what you're doing. We're on the streets, on the front line, you're not. That's hard for a provider who then thinks a commissioner will retaliate in other ways. So I think I'm always very proud of that. And I think some of the lows have been when I think there's a public management and that strong drive that unless it's in the data report, it didn't work. But then you've got Kevin here saying his numbers have reduced. Well, you know, that there it is. And I think some of the lows are trying to remind, and Alex and myself, we have to remind ourselves regularly, you know, we are not being driven by data here. We're being driven by learning, and data will influence and support it. But the key of what I now see myself as a commissioner to learn, and Alex and my team and Andrew, who's in our team, we commission to learn. We don't commission to outcomes.
Thanks, Katie. Such an important distinction. Data is important, but for the service of learning, not in service of controlling or compliance.
Yeah.
Such a strong message coming through. So in a moment, we'll come to our final question, which is all about what difference does it actually mean for the people you're supporting? How are you engaging people with lived experience in this approach? Some questions about, are they involved in the reflective learning spaces, for example? And before I do that, Jenny, can I come to you? What's going on Slido, and any more questions to feed in?
Yeah, certainly. So we have had 10 responses to the Slido, so I'd encourage as many people as possible to take part. But there's some quite kind of clear words coming out as kind of commonly sort of felt. So remember that the question was, how does it feel, or would it feel to work in an HLS way? And the kind of most common responses are that it would feel meaningful. And these other ones are different, real, radical and new, which could be taken as a positive, but also could be maybe a little bit more scary, or that they're kind of unknown. Some of the other questions, or answers rather, creative, powerful, impactful, constructive. So lots of really sort of positive responses, I think. And especially, I think, going into the next question, service user led, and also looking at trusting equals powerful and real human relationships. So I think there's a good lead in there for the next question. But again, please keep on adding your stuff. It's really useful to get a good reflection from everyone else. There was a question that came up which we can ask of the panelists and leave it up to them to decide whether they want to invite other people to get in touch with them over email. But that was just a kind of question that's been asked.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Jenny. That's really helpful. So what we can do is, it's how old is it? A year and a half old now, but there is a Human Learning System case study all about Liverpool's work, which we can pop in the chat. And yeah, Katie, Alex, Kevin, Sophie, Tony, if you are happy to share your e-details, if you could pop them in the chat at the end, if you're happy for people to get in touch. And yeah, everyone on Slido, please keep adding your thoughts. So the final question for the audience is, what change have you seen, or what change do you hope to see through working differently, working in a HLS way? So if you pop that in the Slido, and then I'll come back to our speakers now to pose the kind of question to them. What difference is this making, and how are you involving people you support in shaping this approach? Alex, can I come to you first?
So I'd say I'm going to leave the bit about how it's impacting current service users to Tony and Sophie and Kevin, because they see much more of that through their work. But I would say one of the areas for development with the contract across the next year is involving lived experience in how we understand and learn around what we're delivering. So that's an area for growth for the future, because we haven't managed to capture lived experience voices so far. I think it's one of those really complex things to try and do when we're working with individuals who are at crisis on the streets. So we're trying to take a really thoughtful approach as to how we would do that and learn from others who are already practicing it. I think one of the things I would say it's not that we haven't had input, because we work closely with the operational frontline team. We hear the stories of individuals experiencing the service through the staff, and they obviously have close relationships with individuals who are being supported through the service. So there is, to some extent, we have heard about the impact it's having, but it's secondhand right now. And there is the hope that, like I said, across the next year, that's a big focus for me moving forward. Because, for example, with the individual that the team have just worked to get indoors, it would be brilliant to kind of be able to pose the question to them around, what was it like? What was it like being supported through that experience, and what can we learn from their experience as well? So we've still got a way to go with that. But yeah, we're going to get trying. So that's probably where they was engaging lived experience right now. But I know that Tony and Sophie might have more to share around how it impacts people day to day and what they've seen working in this way.
Thanks, Alex. Yes, Tony and Sophie, it would be great to hear from you. Having that flexibility for a commissioner, how does it make a difference to the people you're supporting, to start with?
From our point of view, it's that we can respond immediately, so we can make quick decisions without this sort of bureaucracy of admin. I can speak to either Katie or Alex, and we can make a quick decision to do something, and that often has a very, very quick outcome for the client, and a positive one. Also, that we can do things differently. So the hours that we work and the times we work and the way that we work isn't structured. I can completely tip my work upside down, and I think I could ring Alex and say, I can't attend this meeting because it's really important that I have to go and support this client. If she would be okay with that. Most of the meetings, I'm sure there's one or two she might say, no, you need to be there, but generally I think if I said that this was more important to do, or couldn't we just try this, and it sounds a little bit sort of left field, but can we have a go at trying this? I think that would be listened to. I think in terms of the clients, it's the partnership, the fact that all the agencies on this call, but then other agencies involved as well, all came together to support an individual client, and he's now in the accommodation he needed, getting the support he needed, and the healthcare that he needed. I think that's how that impacted on the individual client. So there was everybody working together. There was lots of meetings, lots of MDTs. You know, sometimes it felt like you were running up a hill, you know, with 10 backpacks on. But, you know, we got there in the end, and it would be really interesting for maybe Alex to have a conversation with him in a couple of months to see, you know, what his thoughts and feelings on how that went. We really intended to get volunteers involved more a lot in the service and start to get as much lived experience voices in the service as possible. COVID sort of jumped in the middle of our service, and we were very we had to be very controlled about where we worked and who was working together. So the volunteer part of the service, which was actually in the original spec, is probably a year and a half behind where we wanted to be with it. We do have volunteers in other areas. We are starting to sort of use that as part of our service delivery. But the pandemic, and then the end of the pandemic was as difficult as the middle of it, because it was everybody in and then everybody out. So we sort of had to deal with how to sort of manage that in terms of our sleeper numbers and accommodation. So that is something that we do want to work towards, but you know, just things unfortunately took priority over that at the time.
Yeah, I guess there's that continual evolution over time as you learn. And Sophie, anything you wanted to add about what differences the approach makes?
Yeah, I think Tony's sort of hit the nail on the head, and I think those left field ideas are things that we feel as a service we can throw into the mix, and we can go to our commissioners and go, actually, this might be really unusual, maybe a bit radical, but can we try this? And we don't feel sort of afraid to do that, and I think that's really good. And it means that we can try things in a different way to get a different approach. And I think the frontline staff as well feel confident enough to do that as well. And sometimes those ideas might actually not be the way we end up going, but we're listening to them and we're thinking, okay, you're thinking outside the box, and that's what we want to hear. I also think it's the trust that Tony and her team, they know what they're doing, and they have that experience of outreach, and they know kind of what works and what doesn't, and so the trust from Alex and Katie to sort of say, yeah, you know, Tony, you and your team, you know the people that you're working with, and you know the areas, and you know the relationships that you've got, and that's really helpful for us as a service to feel that trust and feel like we can run with it.
Thanks, Sophie. And I see Graham, who's actually from one of the other local authorities involved in this approach, is also helpfully pointing out in the chat the importance of tailoring approaches to local needs, so tailoring them to each of the patches within the combined authority area. The fact that there's a huge amount of overlap between HLS and other place-based approaches to commissioning, which really do flex both to the place and individuals within that as well. Kevin, it'd be great to hear from you. Kind of what difference have you seen this approach make from your perspective?
I think the main difference I've personally seen is just how the service has developed from day one, when a lot of our service users were a little bit sort of, who's this person now in St Helens, and why is this person waking me up in the morning and asking me if I'm okay? And it was very much sort of, we'd just get them into the system, and they'd go along this conveyor belt into accommodation, and they'd get forgotten about and lose that accommodation, and then they'd come back in. But I think, as Sophie said, the frontline staff are far more experienced than I am as a commissioner in terms of delivering that outreach service and helping this client group and understanding the client group. So for me, it's about us as a local authority trusting Tony's team to do their job, to support us to do our other parts of our job when we need to challenge other services, but again, working together to sort of with that end goal of helping the client. So I do know now that a number of the staff in the frontline team are sort of, they're just on first name terms with all the clients in the borough, and people will stop me in the street and say, you're from the council, where's Andy from Whitechapel? I need Andy. So it's just really, really good to see that service now.
Thanks, Kevin. So this has been a brilliant discussion and the time has flown by. What I'm going to do is we're going to pose a question to the audience in Slido, and then I'll come back to all of our speakers here for kind of, I'd really appreciate kind of your reflections and also any advice for people listening who want to get started. What would your advice be? Whether you're a provider, whether you're a commissioner, whether you're a local authority, what would your advice be on kind of getting started? So the question in Slido is, for everyone listening to this discussion today, what word sums up the discussion for you? Ellen's just popped that link in the chat. So if you, while you're listening, if you'd just like to pop in one word that sums up today's conversation for you. And then I will come back to our speakers now. I think everyone's got their heads down thinking. So Tony, you look ready. Sorry to pick on you. And what are your reflections from today's conversation, and what advice might you have for others who want to get started?
In terms of advice, I think you've got to embrace it fully. I wouldn't say do it half-heartedly, because then it would just feel a little bit false. Trust in the process. If it feels a bit awkward and natural at first, that's, it's like learning to drive a car. Nobody could change gear, in the first driving lesson. So, accept that it will get better, but also accept that the outcomes at the end will be worth the extra input that you have to put into it. In terms of reflections on the conversation, it's lovely to hear from, the local commissioners and the combined authority now that we're all one team now, because it wasn't like it's taken his work, but the trust is there and the outcome is there for the clients, but then also for my services, a happy, trusting team, and we work well together. And I've worked in services that feel under pressure due to a lot of pressure being put upon them, and I can see the difference, having worked in both different ways, that even though this is it takes more maintenance, it's worth it for the service users, but also for the team.
Yeah, far more motivating, I guess, for you and your staff to work in this way. Sophie, how about you? Takeaways and any advice, particularly as someone who's relatively new to this? What would you say to others who are just getting started?
I suppose just before I'd give any advice, not that I'm sure I've got much to give, but I suppose one of the observations that I've had from coming in to sort of managing Tony's team is she's got a really happy staff team. They really enjoy their job, and I think that those relationships that don't feel top heavy, that don't feel kind of like, oh, can't talk to commissioners kind of scariness, it's not there. And they are a happy team. They feel confident in their jobs, and they feel confident raising things, and it's really, really nice to see, really encouraging. I think that like Tony said, sort of embrace it, and I think it's quite a brave step to make as any organisation to go into any sort of system change, whatever that looks like. But yeah, I think it's worth it. I think that what Katie was mentioning earlier about starting small on a smaller scale is a good way to go. So yeah, that's from me.
Thanks, Sophie. Kevin, how about you?
I think my observation would be is if you're starting off on this process, to almost have your service specification written in pencil. So at any time you can change what that specification is. So you might start off with what you think is the perfect service and contract and commission, and 6 months into it, you've realised it's not quite achieving what you want it to. So you need to be able to have those honest and quite difficult conversations at times to say, look, we need to change this service if we can within the contract. Don't get hung up on performance indicators about numbers of people seen, or it's all about the individual and the outcome. So for me, it's far better to help a smaller number of people successfully and permanently than to just tick a box saying, yeah, we've seen 40 people this month. And I suppose my final observation is that I'll see Tony Morgan at 7 o'clock on Friday morning for the next sweep.
I hope you're both feeling better by then, and thanks for joining us, even though you're both feeling a bit sick today. But yeah, hopefully you're doing better by Friday at 7. Alex, can I come to you? Any takeaways and any tips?
Yeah, I'd just say it's like everyone else, I guess, really encouraging to be able to sit here with all of our partners and hear that they also appreciate this approach. I think often I get asked to talk on human learning systems. It's really nice to have their input. and to hear it. And I think that there are the similar things we all find really positive about the approach, and things that we also all find quite tricky. So that's really encouraging. My advice to people would always be, I think, and this may be counter to what other people might think as well, but I find when you're taking on a human learning systems approach, the human aspect is probably the greatest part to, like, if we can stay human in all of our conversations, even when it's really difficult, and we want to sometimes go back to being more rigid and within our role as commissioner or our role as provider. I think if we can always focus on being human, then we have much more positive and encouraging conversations. And I think that can be where we can create change. So that I would just say, try and encourage people, if they're trying to do this approach in other areas, or they want to start the conversation about human learning systems in the work that they're doing. And I think go at it with a cup of tea and a chat first, and really share what it is that they're potentially frustrated with their current approach, but go at it in a human way. I think that's really helpful.
Great takeaway. Go at it in a human way with a cup of tea. I'm sure we'll all try and put that one into practice. And Katie, how about you? Takeaways and any tips and advice?
I think enjoy it, start small and give it a go. Give it a go, and don't get bogged down by process, because we'll end up back to what we're doing now. And also really trust if you're going out to commission, and you know what, even if you're contract monitoring now and you've got a commission service, you can start doing it now by changing how you do that contract monitoring. It doesn't need to be recommissioned or something. You can start with a different approach, but just be led by the trust and respect of your providers who know what they're doing. And actually, maybe I think again, that's one thing I think the operational staff on this service understand. We fully respect them. And actually, they've had a big influence on quite senior management in local authorities. They've had a lot of opportunity to speak to senior managers and to present. And that's how it should be. They're the people who are delivering. So I think let your services speak for themselves and the impact. But yeah, enjoy it. And yeah, enjoy it and take some paracetamol. Tighten yourself up, but do it. It's the best thing we've ever done. I'm looking at all their faces and they're all...
Thanks, Katie. I think this conversation has just demonstrated that. And yeah, I completely admire all of your bravery. I'm really giving this a go, sticking to it and seeing such great benefits. And sometimes, human learning systems sound so obvious, but it's like, of course we want to do those things, but the depth you have gone to in terms of being human, that trust, that empathy, those relationships that are very, very mutual, and you're all in it together, that learning is embedded in everything you do. You're constantly asking questions. You're trying to act straight away to provide better support to those people that you work with. And yeah, that one team approach, both how you all work together, but also how you take responsibility for trying to engage with and also challenge other bits of the system as well, really, really jumps out strongly. Yeah, I love that line, Katie, let the services speak for themselves. How do we, I guess a key part of HLS is that devolving of decision making much closer to the ground. When you're working in complexity, the people who know best are the people who are actually experiencing the issues themselves. So thank you so much, all of you. I've absolutely loved being able to hear your story and from so many different perspectives. So thank you so much. I'm going to hand over to Jenny now, who's going to give us a quick flavour of the Slido and then close the session as well.
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. But more than that, thank you to all of you for sharing all your experience and your thoughts. It's just been brilliant. The Slido is really heartening as well, so it's well worth a look. So I think that the key words that are coming out, the biggest one is encouraging. So the thought that this kind of conversation can help galvanise others to action is, well, a very positive thought to take away from an afternoon. But encouraging, uplifting, inspiring, motivating, hopefully all these things will lead to extra energy for action. There's also a nice word in here, which is genuine, and I think I'd share that as well. I think it's really lovely to be able to talk about things like services that can obviously often be couched in formal language to hear it all spoken about in such a sort of genuine and human way. So yes, the Slido is well worth a look, but also keep on contributing. There's only 9 people who've contributed, and I can't believe that there are other people who don't have things to add. But it's now time to wrap up. And so obviously there's the big thank you for those of us, those people who've kind of taken part in the conversation, but also just all of you for coming along and contributing. I think at one point we had just under 60 people. And we've certainly had loads of contributions in the chat, really active chat, which is lovely to see. Lots of people asking questions, and obviously we're only able to answer a few. But I've noticed that some people have been diving in and answering each other's questions. So again, that's a really lovely thing to see. We've got one request, which is that we're going to share a link to a feedback survey, and we very much appreciate it if you could just take the time to answer that. We'd also like to encourage everyone to come along to the closing session on Friday. That's on Friday at 1 p.m. You'll find the link to that to register for that in the same place that you found the link for this one. So the HLS Week link, which I think we can also put in the chat. We're going to, we have recorded all of these sessions, and we'll make all of those recordings available. So any that you've missed, you can take part or, consume. And I think we'll be sending that around in about 2 weeks' time. So we will be sending it out to the email addresses of people who've registered. And I hope that you noticed, but I think everyone involved in this chat has put their email addresses into the chat window. So for those of you who wanted extra information, you can use that to contact people directly. So thank you. I think is a really generous act. So thank you for that. So that's it. But thank you so much, everyone, for taking part in all the different ways that you did. And I think now we should follow that call to action and go and have a cup of tea. So I look forward to seeing that on Twitter as well. I think that's got branding on it. Okay, so thank you, everyone, and goodbye.